Hi, this is Bill, and this is Progpaganda. I've been a fan of progressive rock for the last 50 years or so, and there have been many times over the years where people who are being exposed to the genre for the first time have taken me aside and said, "This is really interesting stuff, but where did it all come from? Where did prog rock get its start?" There are people out there who think that the genre started with a big bang in October of 1969 with the release of a single album, King Crimson's debut in the Court of the Crimson King. But it wasn't the start of prog rock per se. There were quite a few things that happened in the 1960s, both artistically and in the music business, that helped prog rock to emerge in the manner that we now know it. In this series, I'm going to go over a bit of that history, and I'll discuss 25 albums that are very significant to the emergence of prog rock. In my opinion, prog rock might have become a very different animal from the one we've come to know and love had these albums not been created over the course of the years 1965 through 1969. Just a quick recap of the criteria that we used to select the albums that comprise the 25 proto-prog albums that shaped prog rock. First off, we selected albums based on their influence. It could be based on the artist's innovation, based on cultural influence, or the use of technology. We restricted ourselves to a single entry per artist on the list in order to promote diversity of the music of the time and to make sure that certain artists that had tremendous commercial appeal at the time didn't dominate the list. Today's album is from June of 1966. It's Bob Dylan's Blonde on Blonde. Bob Dylan had to be on this list. Bob Dylan influenced pretty much everything that was happening in popular music in the early and middle 1960s, and in fact, really going into the 70s as well. But his greatest impact, at least in my opinion, was in the 60s. I have to confess that in compiling this list, I was undecided at first about which Dylan album I would include. This was one of the cases where I bucked up against my own constraint of, one entry per artist. In particular, the album that Dylan made prior to Blonde on Blonde, Highway 61 Revisited, is a landmark album in its own right. It contains Bob Dylan's breakthrough electric single, Like a Rolling Stone, and the sessions from Highway 61 also produced a great non-LP single, Positively 4th Street. I went with Blonde and Blonde for the list for a couple of reasons. Number one is, it's a double album. Arguably the first ever rock and roll double album. Freak Out by Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention came out shortly after Blonde on Blonde. Some people have argued that that one deserves consideration as the first rock and roll double album because Bob Dylan is not rock. But again, Bob Dylan influenced everything. So I would definitely call Blonde on Blonde the more influential of the two. Frank Zappa appears on this list too, by the way, so don't worry about him. He's covered. But the fact that this was a double album was significant. Rock and roll fans generally were discouraged from spending too much time on albums at all in the middle 1960s. Singles were where the money was commercially. Teenagers were thought to not have the money to buy albums. And so most rock and roll albums were done usually in the matter of a couple or 3 days, work up the songs that would be considered as singles and make sure that those are polished, and treat the rest of it as filler, is how it was usually done. Dylan, being a major star by 1966, was pretty much allowed to do what he wanted in the studio. Even Highway 61, although a single album, was a very long album at 52 minutes in length. Blonde on Blonde was probably about another 20 or so minutes longer in content and required the extra space of a second album. And CBS Columbia Records was happy to oblige, thinking that Dylan had a large enough fan base that the album would sell, and indeed it did. It's a significant record for the great Dylan songs that appeared on it. Rainy Day Woman, number 12 and 35, I Want You, Absolutely Sweet Marie, Stuck Inside a Mobile, Just Like a Woman, Visions of Johanna. God almighty, what a great list of songs. And last but not least, it's also significant because it's the first Dylan album that features members of Ronnie Hawkins' band, The Hawks, later to be known as The Band, on the album. They make, I think, only a small appearance on this album, but by the time the album came out, the band was well established as Dylan's backing band for concert performances. And of course, they would, over the course of time, become a major force working with Dylan in the studio. Well, there you have it. We'll be back soon to discuss the next artist on the list. In the meantime, if you have any thoughts or questions about this particular show, please feel free to share them in the comments. And please feel free to subscribe and keep track of upcoming shows as we go forward. Thanks very much. Take care.